Hello, class. Welcome back. So, we continue with this chapter on the conservative tide. Today, we'll be discussing the end of the Nixon presidency. Please title this section of notes The Watergate Scandal. So, I'm sure many of you have heard of Watergate before, at least just the name in the news or some other form of media. The topic itself and the conspiracy are much more complicated and nuanced than you probably realize. So, the goal today is for me to walk you through Watergate and hopefully answer any questions that you have. So, we're going to start by taking a look at Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, who interestingly is accused of conspiracy, bribery, and tax fraud that are traced all the way back to his time as governor of Maryland into his time as vice president. And the reason I tell you this is by the end of today's lesson, you'll see that Richard Nixon is forced to resign from the presidency, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, will assume office. So it's interesting because most people don't know who Gerald Ford is because he's such an outsider. Because the original vice president that was on Nixon's ticket, Spiro Agnew, had to resign before Watergate really started heating up. So Agnew at first claimed to be innocent. As the investigations continued, though, and wrongdoing seemed much more evident, he ultimately pleads no contest, which basically means that you're neither pleading innocent nor guilty. But the underlying message, if you're pleading no contest, that most people will recognize you as being guilty of the crime. So he steps down from office, and we end up with the House Minority Leader, Gerald Ford, becoming the next vice president of the United States. And you can see him being sworn in over there to the left of the screen. So let me talk about the White House plumbers as this group that are ultimately going to be carrying out the scandal. So it's a covert group that are established after the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. And they're essentially tasked with stopping leaks of information to prevent another issue like the Pentagon Papers from happening. Richard Nixon was an incredibly paranoid person, a very paranoid politician. And it's only logical to imagine him having a covert group overseeing such a task. And you can see the picture of the five of them that will ultimately be arrested for the Watergate scandal over here to the right hand side of the screen. So, in terms of where the name plumbers actually come from, just listen to this. On Thanksgiving evening in 1971, NSC Staff Assistant David Young arrived home from his planning at the Special Investigative Unit when his grandmother asked him, "What do you do at the White House?" He replied, "I am helping the president stop some leaks," and she exclaimed, "Oh, you're a plumber." So young E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy then put signs on their office door with the title The Plumbers. These were taken down as Watergate really came to the public's attention, but it's interesting where the origin of this group's name really comes from. So, the first notable task of the plumbers was discrediting Daniel Ellsberg. You'll recall that he was the one who ultimately is the whistleblower who leaks the Pentagon Papers to the presses. And again, this reveals the wrongdoing of the US government, the fact that the president had been lying to the public, really discredits LBJ. And Nixon is very angry by the public image this gives to the presidency, which is why the plumbers try to discredit him. Essentially, they break into Ellsberg's therapist's office to try to get like dirt on him to discredit Ellsberg as a source. But the break in is very obvious. You can see the smashed filing cabinet over here on the left hand side of the screen. And even Ellsberg argues that the government was responsible for the break in. After the Ellsberg break in, the plumbers kind of like fade away a bit, but a small number of them are actually retained, and some of them are employed by the CRP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, that is mockingly referred to as CREEP. You'll see it actually written about both ways in a lot of tests and sources and things like that. But basically, it's a fundraising organization for the Nixon 1972 campaign. And again, just put a small star next to this in your notes. Some of them are former plumbers, part of that covert organization that, again, was largely disbanded after the Ellsberg break in. And you can see an actual button mocking the committee over there to the left hand side of the screen. This is the sign on the um, office door of the CRP. This is G. Gordon Liddy, who was one of the first officials to propose the idea of breaking into the Watergate Hotel to get information on the president's adversaries. This is actually known to even the U.S. Attorney General, John Mitchell. And together with John Dean and several others, they actually manipulate this plan a little bit and simplify it, but it's ultimately still carried out. So in June of 1972, the five men, these plumbers, are arrested while breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and they're carrying wiretapping equipment. These are the five men, the five burglars who were ultimately arrested. And you can see some of the evidence that was taken from them: a transistor radio, a two-way walkie talkie with microphones running into what seems to be like chapstick capsules. And of course, as soon as this happens, the Nixon campaign has to go on the defense. Nixon, claiming to have done nothing wrong, he admonishes them as like third rate burglars, like who should not earn anyone's time or attention. But you'll see that this is going to continue for several years. And as more evidence comes out, it becomes more and more dire for the Nixon presidency. So two of the notable burglars are pictured here. You can see that's G. Gordon Liddy to the left and E. Howard Hunt over there to the right. And you'll see as these investigations continue and the interviews continue that more and more information seems to tie the Watergate scandal back to the Nixon presidency. So, two reporters that are investigating Watergate are Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who are reporters for the Washington Post, and they're the ones who are really going to bring a lot of attention to the story. Both men, even in modern day, um, retain their prestige and are two of the most well-known names in journalism, even now. And the two composed a book in 1974 called All the President's Men, documenting their investigation, how they acquired a lot of their information, and then ultimately the downfall of the president. Bob Woodward had secret meetings with a insider, a government official who went by the pseudonym Deep Throat because of his raspy voice. And we now know that Mark Felt was actually Deep Throat, and he was giving secret information to Bob Woodward in 1972, who would then share it with Carl Bernstein, and they would report on it in the Washington Post. And this information was essential to breaking the case of Watergate. In 2005, 31 years after Nixon had resigned from office and 11 years after Nixon's death, a family attorney stated that the former Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) associate director Mark Felt here was actually Deep Throat, and that was confirmed by Woodward and Bernstein later on too. And this is the garage where Woodward was meeting with Mark Felt. And it's important to note that Nixon very easily could have fired the guilty aides around him and maybe have politically survived this, but it's an election year. And the administration makes the decision to pay bribes to the burglars, which immediately makes them complicit in the crime. Nixon also instructs the CIA to stop the FBI investigation, which again would very likely turn into a case of obstruction of justice if impeachment articles were then to be drafted. This is a example of a check of the hush money that was paid to the burglars, $25,000. And this is a picture of the investigations beginning in the US Congress. So this is Archibald Cox. Richard Nixon was forced to appoint a new attorney general and gave him the authority to then also designate a special counsel to investigate Watergate. That becomes Archibald Cox here, who will be, learning a lot of information through his interviews. In one of his interviews with a White House aide, he learns that there's actually a listening device in the Oval Office that captures all conversations. So Archibald Cox then goes on to subpoena those tapes so that he can listen to them and get more information. The Nixon team obviously tries to stop that from happening. In October of 1973, Nixon tells his new attorney general to fire Archibald Cox to stop the investigation from going forward. The new attorney general refuses and resigns in protest. Nixon tries to get several others to fire Cox as well, and they all file suit. This is known as the Saturday Night Massacre, with all of these men resigning and leaving the presidency. Again, just further making the Nixon team look very guilty. And they finally find someone who will fire Cox. And this man over here to the right will actually take over as the new investigator. Again, the names are not very important. Just understand the overall scope of the story. So this is when Nixon goes on national television and gives a speech saying that he is not a crook, and the public perception of the Nixon presidency really starts to disintegrate as the optics of trying to stop the investigation are just not a great look. So, because of public pressure, Nixon turns over some of the tapes. He claims executive privilege to try to stop them all from being released. And one of the tapes that seems to be like talking about topics relating to Watergate very suspiciously has 18 minutes of film or audio, I should say, missing. And this ends up going up to the Supreme Court in the case of the United States versus Nixon. The Supreme Court basically says that Nixon cannot claim executive privilege and the tapes must be released. And this is really the smoking gun, the idea that like this is the evidence that really can't be refuted. It reveals the conspiracy. Congress starts to prepare articles of impeachment. And before they can actually do that, Nixon makes the decision to resign from office. And you can see on the right, that's his resignation letter that was filed to Henry Kissinger. And on the left is a news article with the tagline that Nixon has resigned and Ford is taking basically the oath of office. Here are some pictures. This is Nixon and his wife exiting the White House. The iconic image of him giving the peace signs before getting onto the presidential helicopter and leaving the White House grounds. And just to conclude very quickly, we're going to talk about Gerald Ford in an upcoming lesson, but only a month after becoming president, he makes the decision to pardon Nixon for all crimes. And he uses the exact words, a full, free, and absolute pardon for all offenses he had committed or might have committed during his presidency. Many Americans are shocked by this. They've been taken through this story of Watergate for a very long time, and a lot of them want accountability. They want it to go somewhere, whether it's charges or whatever. Nixon is exempt from basically any accountability for wrongdoing. Ford says it's to spare the nation. But again, many historians argue that the pardon really ends Ford's political career. In our upcoming lessons, we'll look more at the consequences of this. We'll delve into the economy during the 1970s and then explore the presidencies of Ford, Carter, Reagan, and then Bush.